This conference will now be recorded.
But these are good questions that I want to make sure we have for Derek and Mark. The Right now we have two categories of open space. There's prime open space and common open space, and those are defined in the subdivision land development ordinance. If it's considered prime open space, it's very much just a almost like a topographical look at it and the site layout itself. And so it says if there's um, X amount of prime open, or if there's prime open space, you need X amount. If it's common open space that's categorized, you need Y amount. So until we update it, right now, we look at that as staff and our township engineer. But I'm thinking, I guess what you're asking is, would we do something for this area of the township? The requirement would be agricultural types of open space. This area of the township, if it's identified on, I think identifying it on the official map, if it's within an area that's identified as priority natural resource areas, then it should be wildland and some of the conservation types of open space. Is that?
Yeah. Sarah, you wanted to say something, so go ahead.
I did. I don't remember now.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, I remember. So, we're looking at things on an individual basis, right? So you were saying, Chris, about like trying to find that right equation of you can have this much open space or this much, passive area or whatever. I suppose I was looking at it more as a whole of the township. Like, okay, we have a lot of farmland. Maybe we don't need so much. I'm not saying we do or we don't. I'm just using a
Yeah,
list.
just as an example.
We have a lot of farmland. Maybe we won't be rushing to adopt more farmland. Maybe that equation should be more of a township-wide thing as opposed to each individual place that comes in. And I don't know how that would work at all, but that's trying to keep, as we were doing those initial meetings and we were trying to adopt this, what Marie, you and I were there, and we were talking about the things we'd like to see township wide, and maybe not so much of this or a little bit more of this, and so trying just to keep that balance of things township wide rather than each case each not case talking about work now
Each project application.
project application that comes in, rather than dealing with it on that level, saying, well, we're giving you this information up front that we kind of already have a lot of this in this township. Maybe you should focus more on this type of land development. Does that make sense?
Along
Yeah.
the same lines, I mean, wouldn't we want to look at adjacent parcels and see what's surrounding the new development, and because I would think that could influence our decision, right? Our recommendation.
And I think there's kind of two lanes here with I think some of what I'm hearing you guys are talking about now is going to help with our outlook on where to preserve open space.
Mhm.
And how we develop strategies to preserve open space, whether it be us trying to protect those properties because we see kind of that conglomerate of parcels and we have areas that are existing. The site by site review that ends at the boundary of the site. And I mean, we can certainly make comments on it, but when we're reviewing it from a land development perspective, specificity is key, and tying it back to a legal document is key to actually
Right.
get the applicant to do it. So that's where I think leaning on something like the township official map, which is adopted by a resolution, which is very clearly points to it's not just a general area. Well, in some cases, it's more specific. We can say yes, it's on the map, and because your site falls under this sort of category, we expect uh, preservation of natural resources and so
right.
forth. Beyond that, I want to be cognizant of asking too much that gives the developer kind of they might fight back a little bit more, and it's easier to kind of just point to here's the ordinance, here's the official map, and let's require this. as opposed to saying, well, the adjacent property and so forth, because that gives them a little bit more to say about, well, we're not developing the adjacent property. That's not a part of ours. And we
I'm
have
just
no
saying, you know,
usage.
if there's a park in the adjacent property, maybe we'd say, we prefer you use, you develop, you allocate the open space to this type of use instead of a park, you know, I mean, that
Yeah,
sort of thing. I'm
yeah.
not saying.
Or like connections. Hey, you have a park here and you have, something proposed for recreation here. Let's move it up to there to expand upon that. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, definitely that kind of stuff. I just think when we're getting these in and reviewing the comments is just to think about that as specific as we can be. And that'll help us as well develop the new update to Saldo so that you guys have the backing sort of authority to make those kind of comments. Because right now it's do they satisfy the layout of the land in that common versus prime open space?
But it sounds like from what I'm hearing you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a priority for us should be the township map
Yes.
and making sure we define the spaces on the map completely and properly so that we can then refer back to that when we're making any recommendations. So it sounds like that's something we should work on sooner rather than later.
And
Yeah.
it's not been updated for 14 years,
Mhm.
so going on 15. So I really think it's time to look at it.
Mhm.
Sounds great.
Ray, you got a question?
Yeah, no, I have a comment. So, well, let's just say a developer brings a project in and we've talked about us looking at it, we've talked about Parks and Rec, but it's also going to go to someone like Mike Elias
Mhm.
because of stormwater.
Correct.
And so when he looks at it, where do his suggestions come from? Are those
Our
townships?
stormwater ordinance,
The stormwater.
Act 167,
Okay.
the state stormwater ordinance. It's also reviewed by DEP. Many layers of review for that piece of it. And that's where I get a little weary of bringing too much into this board because you guys will never have the teeth behind some of that other stuff where it's going through more of the engineering review for that. And I think if there's comments of stormwater management, those comments also have to align with the other agency reviews, including Public Works and Mike's review with stormwater management
Okay.
and what they're required to do by law.
Okay, yeah. So a stormwater review, that some of that could include like rain gardens, things of that nature. In other words, that could be. I know
Yes
they're
and
little
no. I mean,
sticky,
I wouldn't.
But you know what I'm saying? Because then you're putting in native plants. They require so much.
Yeah, we talked about
space.
this a little bit at the Shade Tree
Yeah,
Commission
see, this
meeting.
is what
So
I'm wondering about.
I think it's if there's something presented, then it's I mean, they need permits for that. So that's what is the stormwater system being presented, how they are presenting to convey the stormwater and what mechanism that needs to be submitted to get the review for that and the approval and the permit for that. If then the EAC says, well, now we want you to also make sure that you're adding native plants and adding additional plantings into that stormwater system, does that conflict with the BMP that's already proposed for the permit? I think it's just it's a tough comment to make because then you don't want them to throw out the comment or the applicant might say, well, we can't do that because our stormwater system is, we have, a lined basin that is meant to take water and move it over here and then into something else. And we have the engineering for that and we can't add additional
That
things
makes
to that.
sense.
So I think the best way to handle something like that is maybe not with the direct stormwater system, but maybe in something that has to do with the management of stormwater or the idea of naturalization in other areas. We talked a little bit about like vegetated swales. I think that's something that is easier than saying like a naturalized basin. Some of the other things we can do is maybe like a green infrastructure guide where that's if there's an opportunity. I think I put into the utility area definition, utility areas, if they're considered as open space, maybe there's an incentive in there to say if it's a stormwater utility area that has a naturalized basin or utilization of green infrastructure, then maybe there's an incentive there for the developer that we can codify in township ordinance so that we are encouraging them in the development of their stormwater system to consider that first instead of us making a comment after. Does that make sense?
Not like necessarily required.
Maybe we could add something
Yeah.
that we have to maintain that then for a certain period of time, or you know, I
That's
don't.
all dictated in townships ordinance and DEP and all the, that part of it is very, very well documented and well handled. We have BMPs that we're responsible for. There are BMPs that the applicants are responsible for. We have stormwater easements in cases. And I don't know, Tom, if you've seen other examples in other communities about what works and doesn't really work when it comes to EAC comments with stormwater. From what I've seen, it's tough. I think it's more just the encouraging of green infrastructure where you can, but when it comes into that, there's, at the end of the day, there's an authoritative
The
review.
calculations have to make sense, right? And they have to work scientifically.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I think it's more about a question of, the EAC making recommendations for the type. Like you said, like a guide, DEP already has the guide. So essentially, you have to use the solution that works best for that particular piece of property. So not every property may be able to use the BMPs that are recommended either, depending on like the infiltration rates and stuff like that. So that's something we definitely have to take into account.
Good example. One of the examples I wanted to share. Sarah, you look like you want to ask a question.
Well, so these recommendations that we make, whether it's for, as Marie said, the stormwater or something, these recommendations certainly are recommendations, and I know my place with that. But if we were to present them to the board and they adopted them, then they now are no longer recommendations. Is that true or false?
Correct. So typically it gets memorialized in a condition of the approval of the plan. So, for example, let's use that shade tree example. The Shade Tree Commission asked for, I believe, like a species change on the plan as proposed, and I think expanding the space between the trees.
Yeah.
When that plan is approved or the plan is recommended for approval by the Planning Commission, a condition is put in that says the applicant must satisfy the comments of the Township Shade Tree Commission.
Mm-hmm.
But it's at the planning commission's discretion whether they do that or not, right? They could say, here's a recommendation, we don't agree with it, and so we're not going to require them.
Usually the planning commission's not doing that. It's the opposite, where the applicant might say, hey, this is kind of a wild recommendation coming from the shade tree or from the EAC. And the planning commission, they're very good at saying, this is the section of the ordinance that the shade tree or EAC is referring to. We also agree with their recommendation because of the intent of the ordinance, and we trust their kind of area of expertise to say that. It's usually much more administrative than just, oh no, we don't.
Okay. Especially with stormwater, right? Like if the calculations don't work and they're not in compliance with Act 167 based on an EAC recommendation, then no, it can't be incorporated at
Yeah,
I mean, we could always, I mean, if we have an idea about stormwater, we can always just talk to Mike, right, and say.
absolutely.
We'll just work it
Yeah,
out, right? I mean,
yeah. Like,
And the township engineer's looking at it as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
stormwater is the one thing that is covered very, very
Yeah.
much. It's all the stuff outside of that I think is where there's a real need for this board to kind of look at things, because we basically have the street frontage is covered. It's highly scrutinized through township ordinances, and if it's a PennDOT roadway, 10 times more than that. When it comes to landscaping and so forth, that's covered by the landscape and shade tree. Once it gets outside of that legal right of way, there's really no one looking at the landscaping that's proposed. Within the site, you have stormwater management areas, which again, it goes back to the calculations of the site, the engineering for it, and what the permit application and the approved permit allows. The open space, we just don't have the I'll say the meat to it in our ordinances now to really make too much of a recommendation, a qualitative recommendation. And I think that Park and Rec Board has started to kind of develop some of that, because they can say things like, we know we need recreation in this area, or we recommend something like that. But then it's the other side of that open space, the intent of that open space. So I think the open space and potentially some of the landscaping as it relates to nature and the environment would be really good areas for this board to look at, and there's nothing covered in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just listening to all this conversation, I think we're really struggling as a new board to understand where our boundaries are, right? And so, I think there's a lot of discussion about should they be this big, so I think we just have to work through some examples, and it'll probably become more evident as we do that as to where we should set the limits of our comments, right, in terms of what we should and shouldn't comment on, or
Well, you have nothing to base it off of.
Right.
We're gonna have to build those limits into the ordinance, so it's tough, and there's not. EACs are very different in how they do that.
Would it make sense to look at some examples from other communities to kind of pick them?
I did a little bit, and I've been doing more conversations with like EAC members or even like planners who are working with their EACs and how they do it. I don't know a lot of EACs that are doing as detailed land development review. So I talked to someone just the other day who's down, I believe she's in Montgomery County, but she's a professional planner by trade and has background in stormwater management. So she is in that role, does a lot more of the land development review than the other members of the EAC. So, and I don't think they have as many consulting engineers doing some of that, or they work with their consulting planner to do some of that. So I think you kind of have to have a best fit for what staff is reviewing, what our third party is reviewing, and then where the recommendation can kind of.
I mean, based on what I've seen from the other regional EACs, I don't think this is a priority for any of the ones I've talked to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are other townships that are doing environmental things, not necessarily with the EAC.
As far as like land development review, or
I don't know about land development review necessarily, but like just more
proactive.
more progress in like environmental like things that they're doing.
Yes, the other EACs that I've interacted with, they've got other priorities. This kind of reviewing open space and such is not the priority that we talked about when I was present. So they're focused in other directions.
Yeah, I think.
Bushkill, their official mark, they definitely conduct land development reviews.
Yeah, and they get pretty detailed into what they're looking at, how they're looking at, when they're looking at it too.
So maybe there's like a hybrid version that makes sense for South Whitehall. Maybe, it would be maybe having a good example of Bushkill to start from, just to kind of see if it makes sense.
And we can certainly invite some other folks to come in and talk to us about that. I'd love that.
Is that where Carrie's at? Is that
Oh,
something like that?
Yeah.
Wow. knowledgeable people over there in that.
Because they've been doing it for a long
Oh,
time.
yeah.
Yeah, it's kind
I'm
of
not
well
saying we have to
over-
do it exactly the way they're doing it, but
Right.
it would just give you a frame of reference.
Yeah, and I've talked to Jason Smith, I've talked to Kerry about kind of their balance
Yeah,
and
there's-
you know,
wow.
and members of their EAC. So it's an interesting, you know, you kind of work with the tools that you have. We have, you know, a great group of members of our EAC, and you guys have kind of your areas of interest. And then we also have staff who has areas of interest. So it's kind of like trying to figure out things also change. We noticed it with our Shade Tree Commission. Shade Tree Commission, we're a lot more involved now. That's we had to expand it to an hour because we have 2 landscape architects that are
great.
landscapers on our Shade Tree Commission, so we can look at a lot more.
Well, go back to what Ally said. I think that's very, very interesting, where you're saying there are some townships who are looking at it from an environmental, more of an environmental perspective. And when I attended the meetings, I know that people were very much interested in preserve this, preserve that. You know, they weren't even sure how it was done, but that's what they wanted. But then there were those small comments, the little comments coming out about the other things that concerned them and why they did not want the development. So I think sometimes it's very helpful to listen to those small comments, those little, what's got these people so upset? Is it the whole general project, or because you're disturbing this one part of it that I see as important? And is that one part important for the rest of the township as well? It could be. It could very well be. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I find that very interesting what you said, Ally, and I thought, and forgive me if I'm mistaken here, but I thought and was hoping I would like to see, and like you said, each of us has our thing. I would like to see a little bit more of that, what we can do within ordinances, within the various laws. I know there's all types of things that govern stormwater, but what else can we do?
As Chris mentioned, steep slopes.
Yeah.
Or repairing buffers.
Mhm.
These are all things we can look at. You know, you have to be careful with woodland protection because there's some preemptive regulations at the state level that really prohibits you from like blanket prohibitions on or blanket restrictions on timber harvesting.
Yeah, I was going to say on timber harvesting.
Yeah, so I have to look at that.
Yeah,
but
look at that.
I mean, definitely start with wetland protection, riparian buffers,
Yeah.
and steep slopes. I mean, those are probably our priorities at this point, right?
Yeah. Other than like wetland protection is, we talked about a lot of planning commission, is kind of dictated at a federal level, but the other ones are there's not really a good state or federal requirement to protect.
Right.
So it's the responsibility of us at the local level to do that, and we don't have the mechanism to do that now, but we definitely want to develop that with this board.
In tandem with the official map.
Yeah, and that all gets baked into that. I think at the end of the landscapes plan, we identified a couple of those ordinances, and there's great models that come from the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission that we can start to look at, and models of surrounding communities. Just a matter of putting pen to paper on those and getting them adopted, and then making sure the official map does that. A good example, if I can kind of just share the one site plan, I think this will help.
I mean, while you're finding that, Chris, I just wanted to add, Marie, I love that you said that, because I think we all have our own, motivations, right, to want to be on the EAC. And I think our first directive is to be able to get through the landscapes plan and do, our due diligence with that. So I suppose the sooner we can get through what we need to do with this, then we can start to focus on our own personal passions, right? So I'm thinking, like, is that realistically something we probably won't get until the end of next year, maybe?
Or do our personal passions, the ideas that we have and that we're putting out here, lend something? It may not be that it's going to be the whole thing that we're all excited about, but it's lending something to some of these ideas and plans.
Yeah, that's like in a nutshell what we're looking for from you guys. We have staff that can work on starting to develop the ordinances, but it's the as residents, as the folks who are thinking about this in your community, in your township, what are the things that we need to either incorporate into that, or how we,
Okay.
how when we get to that next step of, like let's talk about, we definitely need woodland preservation ordinance. It should be covering this kind of stuff. I mean, as an owner of wooded property, what are some of the things that we should be cognizant of, in a way of preserving it, but also not prohibiting too much that it isn't feasible, and how do we start to move on some of that?
But I think Sarah, not to put words in your mouth, but what I hear you saying is that, open space planning and preservation is kind of all consuming right now, but it's not the only thing that the EAC should ultimately be working on.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, and I think we talked about revisiting the work plan in the spring and trying to get some of that stuff in.
We got a lot in front of us now.
Yeah.
Well, right. I know we have a lot to do.
There's and behind the scenes, it all intertwines with a lot, and there's a lot of things we're trying to do in the township. And
Yeah.
Tom and I laugh about it a lot.
It's a lot.
Chris, just,
It's good you can laugh about it, Chris.
I can stay a few minutes longer, but
Okay.
I want to make sure we're respectful.
Sure. All I wanted to show is the one plan here. So, for example, we have an area here where there's some woodlands, existing woodlands. I believe those woodlands are identified on our official map, but we don't have anything that specifically requires the developer to. And the same thing with that other case before, the one on Cedar Crest. The one on Cedar Crest is a woodland area designated on the official map, but we don't have anything that requires them to protect it. So the one on Cedar Crest, they're clearing all the woodlands in order to put those 11 lots there. There's nothing we can really do about it. The township, we can ask, we can't require them. Similar to this, I think it's lot 13 here, which I'm kind of circling,
Yes.
Sarah, is one of the lots that we made a comment from the Park and Rec Board, and from sort of my review in connection to the landscape plan, is that was one that we wanted to flag to the developer. This project was submitted as a sketch plan, so they're not actually asking for any sort of formal action from the planning commission. They're actually asking for comments. This is the one I wanted to present to you guys last month. I don't want to get too deep on this because we went through a series of comments with them last week, and we'll probably see something later. But that was one of the areas where we kind of just requested, can you consider doing something different with this lot here that I'm kind of outlining, Sarah, of trying to preserve some of those woodlands. So if we had woodlands identified on our official map and an ordinance that required them to preserve that, we probably wouldn't see that lot 13 come in there in the first place.
Gotcha.
So again, it's that preventative piece of it. The other thing here is there's a lot of open space proposed as part of this development, but we don't really know much of the intent of that open space. It's existing ag fields right now. There's some wooded areas. They're proposing a trail through there. And that's where that place types guidebook and comments from the EAC would be helpful to the developer to say, following this section of Saldo, define, the areas of open space and their intent. If it's going to be passive recreation, ensure that there's, quality features and facilities there. If it's going to be left as a wild area, consider spacing and consider, habitat management, so forth.
I think it's also worth considering like the amount of invasive species in the wild areas.
Yeah.
Some of them are just like really strangled with stuff. And they could maybe convert it to a managed, like take it out and convert it to a managed natural area and plant intentional plants.
And that's something I've been talking about a little bit with staff, is we don't really require anything as far as a site visit right now, but I'd love to incorporate that into some of the review for some of this, is a site visit, so that we can have more informed comments for that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Allie. And also, when you let a farm field just grow,
Yeah.
I mean, that is the worst possible thing you can do.
Yeah.
It has to be managed,
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And as of right now, I mean, there's nothing, now it's sketch, but we've seen plenty of applications where it's just oh, it's open space,
Yeah.
and it's just a farm field that is reverting on its own.
Right. Which,
If I make a comment slash question, so let's say this plan that we're looking at now, they have the open space, it gets adopted, and it is just that, just something in the open space world. And you do a site visit initially, and you have that, you get that's going through, and you're like, okay, it is open space. My question is, and this might be identified somewhere in the SALDO guidelines, but in a year from now, how long is there a statute of limitations in which they have to keep that open space, or can they a year later say, "Well, we're just going to change it," and then,
well,
Excellent question.
covenant on the plan and declaration for the subdivision, it would be in
Yeah, so
perpetuity.
for this particular plan, they're coming in under a special section of the zoning ordinance that it actually encourages more open space, and in order to do that, they actually have to restrict the property. So for this particular case, it would be in perpetuity. In other situations, we don't always require the open space in perpetuity unless it's something that's the township is coming to, but that is definitely something we are changing with the incorporation of the new open space classifications and the landscapes plan, and
I'm glad to
identifying
hear
the different mechanisms to preserve those, whether it be an easement held by the township, a deed restriction on certain pieces of the property, an easement held by Lehigh County Ag Board, something like that, or ownership of the township. But it's a great question, sir. And we don't have a, and the other thing is it could be open space, but they could change that. This
Yeah.
particular space would be managed by the HOA. So
Mhm.
besides that additional layer of sort of protection for this because of the zoning section, having it restricted, something that just comes in as HOA open space in a by right plan, we don't have a lot of say over or even anything to go back to and say, oh, well, it's kind of different than what you proposed, but it's now your property. So
Right.
that's
They
where
get it rezoned where the house is already built. Fine. Those, you want to knock down a house now build three because you're getting that area rezoned, but this open space can't change. Because that has to be, you have to have this much of a percentage of open space or whatever, whether it's now or 10 years down the road or something.
Farmland preservation.
yeah, exactly. Kind of moving on to official maps. So like I said earlier, all of this is really helpful if we can tie it back to the quote township official map. We've kind of talked about this before. It is essentially what it's described as, and it's the official map for the township. Right now, we have three versions. Sarah, what I have up here is this one. It's hard to see. This is the natural features one. Existing environmental features, natural resources, recharge areas. The next one is the community facilities, conservation lands, historic resources, and transportation facilities. These are all existing. And then the final one has kind of the future outlook. That shows some of the lines here are potential future roadways. This big blue swath here is the kind of Jordan Creek Greenway and so forth. The township official map, and you'll see it in your packet, it gets adopted by resolution, and then it has an ordinance associated, or I'm sorry, it gets adopted by ordinance, and then there's specifications in the ordinance. So, for example, it might say something like if a property is looking to be developed and it's identified on the township official map as something the township might be interested in, we have a limit of time where the township can make an offer to purchase that property. It's very helpful for a number of reasons, whether it be expanding township roadways or expanding and utilizing or requiring trail facilities or other transportation related facilities. And it's great for the acquisition of property or the protection of property. As Tom mentioned earlier, these are very old. These came out of the 2009 comprehensive plan. We have a new comprehensive plan now. We have an open space plan. We're in the middle of a transportation plan. So we're hoping to update the official map with a lot of that information. One of the exercises we talked about this group doing is identifying kind of that natural resource, agricultural, we'll call it the landscape resource priorities. So out of the natural resources, agricultural resources, and open space, we'd like to have those identified in the official map. Historic resources, we have other documentation we're working on that is giving us kind of those geographic locations through our historic resource inventory. My sort of thought for this is I like the idea, and there's different examples. So Bushkill Township has a nice example. We talked about them really kind of being the poster child for a lot of this. And they identify parcels on the map. These are all individual parcels in the township. They have this green highlighted area, proposed greenways to be reserved for open space. So whenever something comes up on one of these parcels that touches the green, it triggers a process from the township, and it triggers a process to the owner and the potential applicant or developer. Some of the other examples, I'm going to switch over. Sarah, are you now seeing my web browser?
Yeah.
Okay. I like this is kind of a similar to the Bushkill example. This was some mapping done for the Northern Lehigh multi-use plan. Multi-municipal plan, and this is, I believe, these are the natural resource priority conservation lands. So these are kind of some weighted priorities that are built off of the overlapping resources of things that, some of the hydrologic resources. These two categories are the are special habitat areas. There's probably not, so some sensitive habitat areas and so forth. Steep slopes is another one. So once you overlay a lot of these resources, what they did here was they identified all of the overlaid areas and kind of created this sort of priority corridor. I think that might be something that we strive for in maybe a natural resource priority and identifying what those potential layers could be, and it's very easy for us to overlap those and kind of see how big of a buffer we might need for that. Same thing for agricultural resources, and have maybe another overlaying sort of layer of these are ag priorities, and then that kind of identifies in a sense your open space areas, and we can talk about whether we expand that or not. But I like the idea of this instead of identifying specific target parcels, especially because in some of these areas we have very large parcels. We have 100-acre parcels, 200-acre parcels that might contain a number of resources, and this way we can kind of nail down maybe a strategy, as you guys pointed to earlier, of let's consider some sort of natural resource protection for this section of the property if it's to be developed, and maybe protection of agricultural for this because we know there's good soils, connected farmland, good access for the farmer, and so forth.
So I see steep slopes on here now. So if someone were to develop or want to develop the areas where it's showing steep slopes, that would trigger our official map currently?
Yes, but we don't have a steep slope ordinance. There's nothing that we can.
No, but we have the official map, right?
Yes, so we could potentially purchase the property. I need to look at the ordinances.
Or negotiate with the property owner to preserve that area.
Yes.
Who
Yes.
coordinates?
With woodlands. Go ahead, Sarah.
Who coordinates that? The negotiation? Not us. I know. I'm just wondering.
It starts with really, I guess, like township staff, and then that becomes a conversation at the planning commission.
So it's part of the township review to confirm whether it's on the official map. I mean, typically this area is not as developed, so we're not seeing as much up here, right? So it's usually down this area, a lot of the development. But
so part of the problem is, it's great if we are able to, as soon as something is on there, yes, we have the pause to start negotiations, but how likely is it that the township is going to flat out buy a piece of property just because it has steep slopes on it?
Well, it's very unlikely right now, we don't have a dedicated
Yeah.
fund.
Yeah, and that's one of many features too. Same thing with woodlands. Like I think I mentioned the 81 South Cedar Crest that has woodlands identified on our official map. But sure, we could potentially stop the conversation and try to, negotiate to purchase the property just because the woodlands are on there. But it would be easier if we had a woodland preservation ordinance that is requiring that they preserve the resource without the township having to just purchase the whole property.
Right.
Now, we could still consider purchasing the whole property if it became a priority across the board. And I think that's kind of what Frank was talking about earlier, like looking at where our township priorities should be. And I could see it being, where we have the most overlap of resources and we have the highest need to protect something, or the converse, the most threatened. That we
When you have like a conservation easement, you wouldn't have to necessarily buy the property fee simple. You could have a conservation easement on the area you want to protect.
Sure, yeah. In that case, I don't know if the developer would do a conservation easement across the whole thing, but for part of it, yeah.
For part of
Yeah,
it.
it's always, there's multiple tools usually that get the most preservation out of it.
So would the goal be if there's development proposed in one of these priority areas, there'd be some additional requirements within Saldo that the developer would have to meet? I mean, is that ultimately where we want to head?
I would love to have that, to directly point to, hey, this is identified in our official map as a natural resource priority. You need to dedicate so much open space or preserve the property like this. And I don't know tonight what exactly that might say, but I think that's something that we should definitely be researching and trying to incorporate into Saldo.
Now, if there's a development, say we identify these priority areas, and there's development that falls outside of those priority areas, do we then have no say in?
So any development that comes in, I think we would still want to have kind of the blanket open space requirements. I
Which
think
are
it would
already
be,
in Saldo.
yeah, I think we'd be updating them anyway, but I could see it as blanket open space requirements, which is very common in Pennsylvania, authorized by the municipalities planning code. And then it would be almost an additional layer of either recommendation or requirement for how they're protecting that area, or whether it's protecting more, protecting a buffer around it, or they have to do a little bit more in addition to those general ones. So right now, I mean, any development comes
For the priority areas.
for the priority areas. But
Yeah,
outside of
that
that,
makes
I think, I would not recommend we get rid of any open space requirements for anything that's outside of priority areas.
No, I'm not suggesting that. So you answered my question. There are already open space requirements, even if something would fall outside these priority areas.
Correct. Anything that comes in, they either dedicate land or donate fees or provide some sort of recreational resource.
And then we could still comment on what we recommend as the use of that open space.
Yes, we can comment on it. We can't require it.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, and it's usually what where the starting point is in kind of those negotiations with the property owner, and then they might say, hey, we really can't squeeze that open space in, but we'll pay the fees.
So how do we start updating these maps?
If you guys like the idea of this sort of layering concept, kind of similar to Bushkill, I think we can start to like lay some of that out as far as what layers. And I'm going to go back to kind of this one. I think this is a good way to sort of visualize like what we would kind of do and bring everything onto it. So
Yeah, it would be nice to have one map instead of three. Is that possible or no?
Yeah.
I think we could do one map for resource priorities.
Okay. That
But
makes sense.
we're-
Like similar to Bushkills.
Yeah, but we're talking about, I mean, we also have transportation on there as well. So I think we'll have a separate.
For the purpose of the EAC,
Yes, yeah.
like it should just be one.
I see
map.
something kind of like Bushkills.
Yeah,
correct.
okay, good.
Yeah.
Very good.
But
Yeah.
I can't promise we'll get away from one map for the rest of our towns.
No,
because we have a lot
I'm
of
just hoping the
transportation.
EAC, when they're reviewing it, you're looking at one.
Yeah, this is kind of split between like we have that greenway buffer and then we have the steep slopes and everything, and we have karst geology on there, which covers almost the entire township, which is
Right.
Yeah, that's
Right.
that's very interesting.
Chris,
Yes.
I know these maps are old, but am I able to find them on the township website?
Yes, and I can just send them right to you, but I usually just go in to the search bar and I just search up here for official map, and then they'll come up.
Okay.
What
But
about
I'll
that?
send them to you.
What about the
Okay.
I can send you the Bushkill. Yeah.
It's on their website.
Oh, that one's on their website?
Mhm.
Okay, so that's, and what is it known as?
I mean, if you have them in front of you, just if you wouldn't mind sending them to us, then we all have the same ones.
Yeah. I'll send them to you along with the ordinance. Because I think it was too big. I tried to reduce the file size. I
Oh,
couldn't
that
send
was
it
the
to you in
problem. I'm
attachments.
sorry. Yep.
No. I can send you it in one separate email with the 3-sheet township official map, and I'll include the ordinance, which is in your packet, so you can start to read through. Now, a lot of it is kind of ordinance language, but you can read through kind of what happens, and that's the the negotiation agreements and so forth. And the
Chris, don't send it. It's so easy to find on the website. I just did it. Don't wait. Honestly, it's so easy to find. Yeah, I apologize.
Okay, great.
No, that's okay. And that honestly, that's the fastest way. I always just go onto the township website and search for it. I think it would be great to have Bushkill Township come out and speak to us,
Oh my gosh.
and I can reach out to Jason. Jason, I'm sure would come. Maybe even Carrie if he can, and they can kind of talk about the two sides of it, from how they look at it when they're reviewing it, and then even from Carrie's perspective as staff when they are how they're dealing with it. Which is always something I'm interested in. It all sounds good, but how does it happen behind the scenes? And
They did a great presentation for us, for Greenbelt United, when we were looking at sustainable warehouses. And they talked about it from how they did things.
Yeah.
And what the requirements for planting, all kinds of stuff. It was just an amazing talk. So, and they're both very easy to understand. They had great PowerPoint. It was really good.
And they might be able to say like things that they wouldn't encourage us to do
Yeah.
for trial and tribulation.
Yeah, like you said, they've been doing this for a long time. That map's
Mhm.
pretty old by now, and they've seen definite successes from it. But
That's
I'd
my
be curious to what
understanding.
the
Yeah.
challenge. Any other questions on official maps?
How do we determine that the designations on the official map are correct or whether they need to be updated?
On the
Change.
current official map?
Yeah.
I would say because we've adopted a new comp plan, I want to throw the whole thing out and start over.
So what information do we use to determine what the new map should look like?
From the like resource protection standpoint,
Yeah.
I'll put together a list of I think data that I know that we can source and circulate that around. Yeah,
Okay.
and I think
Okay,
what
yeah,
I'd be
'cause we
looking
need-
for is
we need-
yeah.
We need something to guide us
Yeah.
as to.
I think even
Yeah.
EAC should have to go out and survey the whole thing.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I've worked with this stuff for a long time. I know a lot of data layers that are out there available, and I think it would be a matter of what's important to us to make sure it's not overkill. Good example, I don't think we need to show karst geology on the official map unless we have a specific reason to.
It's pretty much known.
Yeah,
It's an issue that.
exactly.
Is it known by developers?
Yeah, most
Really?
of them. Well, we require a geotechnical
Yeah.
review.
Okay, so
Yeah.
they would be informed.
Yeah, the fact that it's on the official map doesn't trigger anything additional for us. I should say that. So,
Because we had a fellow from, who redid that, they used the pad of the former, I guess it was Hess's or Bonton warehouse out there in Whitehall, and they built a new one on top of that, and they came to one of our sustainable warehouse forums.
Hmm.
And the guy's from New York. I mean, he was in charge of this, okay, this project. And he came to the meeting in the Q&A, he goes, so is anyone here familiar with sinkholes? And I
Yeah.
was like, oh my. He goes, we had one develop under our wall over here. It just came down and we had to do all this work. And one of the guys said, there, we're real familiar. And I'm like, I don't know. But I was surprised. Now, that was Whitehall Township.
Yeah.
I'm surprised he knew nothing. Knew nothing.
Yeah, they've had some issues in Palmer Township as well.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not, well, maybe it's
Well,
not so
I guess
crazy. I don't know.
I mean, it's one of those things. There's very few areas that aren't technically shown under karst geology, and as Tom pointed out, we get a geotech.
Yeah. Gotcha.
We require a geotech review
Yeah.
anyway, so it's what I like, and that's kind of the challenge with this is there's a lot of great things on there: the steep slopes, the woodlands. We don't have anything. We don't have any teeth to that.
Mhm. Right.
So I want to make sure that what's on our official map we're not taking up space because it can
Yes.
get overwhelming very quickly, and what's on there has a clear function
Right.
in how we're reviewing it.
Makes sense. So that was a good point too that Tom made. I mean, and I guess we'll have to think about that when we look at the map. How many other steps are involved? And you guys know, but we don't. How many other steps are involved, or how many other things are they going to see? Like this thing you're talking about. What did you call it? The GIS.
The GIS layer.
Yeah, they're gonna hear about that. They're gonna know. So no need for us to do anything about
And the geotechnical.
the geotechnical.
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
what it was. The geotechnical
Oh, yeah.
review.
Yeah.
So that's always good to know too. That there are others that are taking up that.
Yeah, again, I think as we go through some examples of this, we'll become more evident what
Right.
our boundaries are, right?
Right.
What are the things we should be commenting on, what are the
Mhm.
things that other people are more
Yeah.
expert or at, and, we should just stay out of.
Well, and I mean, you build upon what we have. We had a great conversation at Shade Tree as an example of we have a lot that we require up front, but we don't necessarily have the boots on the ground when they're installing the trees according to the plan. And we have some level of that, but Shade Tree pointed out, hey, could we require a little bit more that
Mhm.
maybe includes some review from the Shade Tree Commission because we have good commission members, so we can explore that and maybe we can wrap that into the conditions of approval. So if there's something like an additional review or requiring something that we maybe ask of our township engineer to do, certainly start to think about that as we tie it into this process.
Okay, good.
So for official map, I'll start to prepare some data layers that I think we can get in GIS, and then we'll bring that to the meeting, we'll circulate that out, and then we can build off of that and say, oh, we should definitely add this, or we might not need that, and we can start to just play around with kind of the layering of everything.
Okay.
Do you want to talk about meeting dates?
Sure, they're in your packet. I think we went over it before. We're keeping this kind of schedule, so we'll be fourth Monday of the month
For Memorial Day
in December.
December.
Yeah. And we'll meet at 7 because that gives us a little bit more time with Shade Tree.
Okay, very good.
Are we on this calendar, or
Yeah.
The green.
Yeah, we're,
Oh, she
Yeah,
said she.
yeah, down there's Shade Tree and we
Another colorblind challenging map.
I know. I'm sorry about that. That was so. This started out as more something for myself, because it's so. One of the things I this was helpful for us. I'll share it for Sarah. Is that I liked it
Oh, yeah.
for showing all of the surrounding meetings.
Yeah.
Right, which is good for staff.
Yeah,
Good idea.
and so this gives you an idea of the reviews as well, because I think it was important for us to consider with when for next year if we're changing things and how we review plans, because we'll get plans in we have a specific timeline to review those and get comments back out and make a decision. So we want to make sure that we can incorporate all the meetings so that it can get in front of these boards. So that's why I want to see it here, because we'll also have to consider that if EAC starts to look at some of it. I don't want to plan to come in and then the applicant is waiting, 2 months to get a review because they won't get it in time. So just something for us to think about internally. and to give you an idea of maybe why I sometimes get a little stressed when we have meetings like this between BOC, a planning commission, EAC, and Shade Tree, all within like 10 days of each other.
You both go to all this?
No, I mean, I don't go to, we split them up.
I'm trying to not go to
Just
planning.
to confirm, you said 7 o'clock start time.
7 o'clock, yes.
All right.
Yeah, and that is advertised for the next year. So those go out in the beginning of the year, and then we just kind of update the agendas as we have in each one.
Make a motion to adjourn.
I have one thing for courtesy of the floor, but I can bring it back next month. I just want to quick mention that we talked about open space preservation stuff at the last BOC meeting, or maybe 2 meetings ago. We will be working with Trust for Public Land, who is a national organization, on identifying conservation financing mechanisms that could be available for the township for us to consider, like a proactive preservation program. So we'll be starting that work in the beginning of the year, and we'll get some of that information, bring it back to you guys, bring it back to the Board of Commissioners.
Grants.
No, talking about potentially, a municipal bond or increasing the earned income tax, some sort of, long-term financing mechanism. What would be appropriate? What that impact could be. Part of the work we want to do with them is getting the right amount of information so that we as the EAC can craft a message to the public to say, if we're talking about something like this, here's how it could impact you as the township resident, and build our kind of education campaign off of that.
So when we have the Green Gala, we'll be able to have funding for it then.
No. No. and don't tell people that, because that's
That would be illegal.
Yeah.
I'm 100% kidding. For the record, I'm 100%
what we need to make
kidding.
sure people understand it's not for. Yeah.
100% kidding. That was just a joke, not factual.
That would be
Yeah.
somewhat illegal.
Yeah, no, but like added to that, part of if we continue, if we get good results out of this sort of feasibility study, we'll go back to the Board of Commissioners and see if there's interest in doing some polling that we can actually do and get a sense of what kind of items would be necessary to include in that ordinance for maybe a potential November ballot initiative.
Sounds good.
And help answer some of those questions when someone says, "You're going to take my tax dollars and throw a party, Sarah?"
No. No, I'm not going to do that.
She's thinking about it.
Yeah.
Marie, grab me a packet.
Where do you want?